Sirens tore through downtown San Francisco like blades. Outside the St. Francis Hotel, Post Street turned into a sudden battlefield. Blue uniforms, dark suits, shouting voices colliding in a frantic knot of bodies. Secret Service agents surged first, shoulders down, scanning hands, faces, pockets. SFPD followed hard, forming a moving wall that crushed the crowd backward. People screamed and stumbled over the curb, dropping purses, cameras, flags, anything that slowed them. Then she was there, small, plain, unremarkable at first glance, until her arms snapped up with a cold, practiced certainty. A sharp crack split the air. For half a second, the world didn't breathe. Then chaos detonated. "Gun!" someone yelled, and a dozen men slammed into her at once. She hit the pavement with a dull thud, cheek grinding against the concrete, breath knocked out of her like confession. Steel bit into her wrists, handcuffs cinched so tight they looked welded. A .38 revolver was ripped from her hand, yanked away like a venomous thing. 1, 2, 3. An officer counted the rounds out loud, voice shaking, as another snapped the cylinder shut and pocketed the weapon in a marked evidence bag. Cameras flashed in savage bursts, immortalizing her face in the exact moment history tried to change. Above the hotel entrance, a fresh bullet hole stared back like an open eye. White plaster shredded, a small crater that proved the president had been inches from a public execution. Agents pushed her to her knees. She didn't thrash. She didn't plead. She lifted her head slowly, eyes dry, expression empty, calm as ice, as if she'd rehearsed this ending in her mind long before the first siren ever screamed. A federal voice cut through the noise, flat and merciless. Attempted assassination of the President of the United States. The penalty fell like a death bell, life imprisonment. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply stared ahead, unblinking, like a woman who already knew how the story would close. Before Post Street became a crime scene map, before the bullet scarred the hotel wall, Sara Jane Moore moved through America like a quiet statistic, an accountant with tidy handwriting, a suburban mother who knew how to pack lunches, smile at neighbors, and disappear behind the most disarming mask of all, normal. She had the kind of face that passed through crowds without leaving an imprint, the kind of voice people forgot the moment it stopped speaking, but the calm surface hid fractures that started early, an unsettled childhood, a hunger to belong, a mind that never stayed anchored. Marriage didn't stabilize her, it cracked her further. She drifted from one relationship to another, from one job to the next, carrying an identity that changed shape depending on who was watching. In the early 1970s, while the country burned with anger and ideology, she found a new orbit, radical circles that promised meaning, purpose, even salvation. She volunteered, offered rides, made coffee, listened more than she spoke. She collected names the way others collected recipes, quietly, carefully, like a woman building a private ledger of trust. To the militants, she looked sympathetic. To the authorities, she looked useful. And that was the hidden truth buried under every polite gesture. Sara Jane Moore wasn't only leaning toward extremism, she had also been an informant, feeding fragments of conversations to handlers who believed they were controlling the flow. She lived in the seam between two worlds where loyalty was always temporary and betrayal was a form of survival. Each day she played both sides, and each night the line inside her thinned. Harmless by appearance, dangerous by proximity, she became a shadow that moved through meetings and living rooms alike. Never fully radical, never fully law enforcement, but close enough to both that a single wrong step could turn her into either a dead woman or a killer. It didn't begin with a gun, it began with whispers. Sara's first real step into extremism was small enough to disguise as curiosity. One meeting in a dim apartment where the curtains stayed closed even at noon. One introduction where names were never spoken twice. One handshake that felt less like friendship and more like initiation. After that came the coded phone calls. Voices kept low, sentences clipped, addresses traded like contraband. She learned the language of conspiracy, how to say everything without ever saying the crime. And for a woman who had spent years drifting through roles, it was intoxicating. Purpose wrapped around her like a coat. Suddenly, she wasn't just a mother, an accountant, a forgettable face. She was necessary. The militants didn't want patience or paperwork. They wanted spectacle. They spoke of headlines like scripture, of violence as theater, of the president as a symbol that needed to be shattered in public. Sara listened, nodding, absorbing their hunger the way dry soil absorbs gasoline. She moved closer, became useful, earned glances of approval that felt like oxygen, but every step inward tightened the trap, because she was still reporting, passing fragments to handlers, handing over names, pretending she could balance on that razor forever. The more she reported, the more she risked exposure. Radicals were paranoid by nature. Betrayal was their favorite diagnosis. She began to feel eyes on her back, began to hear her own footsteps too loudly in hallways. And fear is a violent chemical. It turns logic into instinct, turns instinct into obsession. Somewhere in that pressure cooker, between secret meetings and whispered threats, between the lies she told militants and the lies she told law enforcement, her mind flipped like a switch. The informant persona stopped feeling like control and started feeling like weakness. She no longer wanted to observe history. She wanted to seize it. She began imagining the moment that would erase every doubt about her loyalty. Not a report, not a tip, a shot, a single trigger pull that would make her untouchable to the radicals and unforgettable to the nation. In her head, the act grew clean, inevitable, almost holy. And once a person starts believing murder is purpose, the distance between thought and action becomes terrifyingly short. The files on Sara Jane Moore did not begin on the day she fired. They were older than the gun, older than the crowd outside the St. Francis. Paper trails stacked in government cabinets where nightmares sleep with labels. In the hours after the attempt, federal agents tore through records like men digging for a buried bomb. Her name appeared again and again: interview notes, surveillance logs, psychological assessments, informant contact sheets. Each page a quiet confession that she had been seen before. There were entries describing her as unstable yet cooperative, politically agitated yet manageable. A woman seeking attention, a low-level threat. Words that now tasted like poison. In a downtown command post under harsh fluorescent light, analysts pinned her timeline to the wall. Dates, addresses, phone numbers, aliases, circles of acquaintances marked in red. They traced her movements across San Francisco like blood through veins. Who she met, where she volunteered, which meetings she attended, which numbers she called late at night. Audio technicians replayed recorded fragments of her voice, slowing the tape until every breath sounded guilty. A separate team interviewed officers who had previously handled her, men who shifted in their chairs, sweating under questions they couldn't answer. Why was she released? Why was she dismissed? Why was a woman with documented volatility allowed to drift so close to the president? Every document carried the same chilling undertone. The system had looked directly at her and chosen not to see the weapon forming inside her. And in the aftermath, when the city still smelled of exhaust and panic, the case stopped being only about a bullet that missed by inches. It became an autopsy of institutional blindness, how a threat can grow in plain sight while the paperwork insists she is harmless. Sara Jane Moore was a woman stitched together from contradictions, and every seam was ready to split. She could look like someone who balanced a checkbook at the kitchen table, yet speak with a sharp, feverish intensity about revolution and blood. She could charm a neighbor in the morning, then spend the afternoon in rooms where the blinds stayed drawn and the air tasted like cigarette smoke and paranoia. She wanted stability, but chased chaos. She wanted to belong, but carried suspicion like a second pulse. Friends described her as restless, always reinventing herself, always changing her story, depending on who was listening. One week, she was a devoted mother trying to keep life neat and respectable. The next, she was a political volunteer drifting through radical networks, collecting slogans like medals. Underneath it all was an anger that didn't know where to land. She blamed ex-husbands, employers, the system, the entire structure of the country, as if America itself had personally betrayed her. Investigators later called it ideological confusion, but it felt more like emotional hunger, an obsession with being significant. She craved attention the way addicts crave relief, and in the 1970s, attention was easiest to earn through extremes. She studied the news with the focus of a gambler reading cards, fixated on power, symbols, and public moments where history could be forced to kneel. The more she talked, the more she seemed to believe her own performance. She wasn't fully militant, not fully informant, not fully civilian, just a shifting figure slipping between categories, surviving by deception. That unstable mixture made her unpredictable, and unpredictability is what security systems fear most, because it meant she could wake up ordinary and go to sleep convinced she had been chosen to change the world with a single violent act. The day before the president came to San Francisco, Sara Jane Moore was already vibrating with intent. Yet the city still treated her like a nuisance, not a threat. A patrol unit stopped her on suspicion, the kind of routine contact that usually ends with a warning and a shrug. But when the officers searched her, the mood changed fast. From her belongings, they pulled out a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog, heavy and blunt like a street hammer, along with 113 rounds of ammunition, a number so excessive it felt like a statement. The cartridges clinked into an evidence tray one by one, bright brass catching the light, each round a tiny promise of violence. Her face didn't collapse into panic. It hardened. She watched the seizure with the quiet fury of someone being robbed, not rescued. Paperwork followed. Questions, a brief detention, a mild evaluation of risk. Someone looked at her profile and saw disorder, not assassination. Someone chose to believe that confiscating a weapon meant confiscating the will. By evening, she was released. No cuffs, no federal lockup, no emergency alert to protect the president. Just a woman walking back into the San Francisco night with empty hands and a mind burning hotter. In the logic of law enforcement, the danger had been removed. In Sara's logic, the moment became a dare. If the state had taken her first gun, she would simply acquire another. If they were watching her, she would move faster. That confiscation didn't stop the plot. It sharpened it, turning hesitation into urgency. Somewhere in her chest, pride curdled into obsession. She wasn't going to retreat now. She was going to prove to radicals and handlers alike that she wasn't a whisper in a file. She was action. And when she walked away from that stop, unbroken and uncharged, history was already sliding toward Post Street, toward a second weapon, toward a crowd, toward a missed bullet that would change everything. Morning light over San Francisco should have softened everything. The bay haze, the pale sky, the traffic waking up. But Sara Jane Moore moved through it like a person already cut loose from ordinary time. The .44 Bulldog had been taken from her, along with the obscene stash of 113 rounds, yet the confiscation didn't drain her. It redirected her. By mid-morning, she was hunting for replacement steel, not comfort, not doubt. She knew exactly what she needed, something smaller, faster to hide, easier to raise in a crowd. A .38. Simple, familiar, deadly enough at 40 feet. In a city where guns could be found like secrets, she moved from contact to contact with the cold efficiency of an accountant balancing an invisible ledger. A name passed quietly, an address scribbled, then destroyed. A door opened only a crack, then wider when the cash appeared. The revolver felt lighter than the Bulldog, but in her palm it carried a sharper promise. Compact, quick, a weapon made for sudden history. She checked the cylinder with hands that didn't tremble, no practice range, no careful testing. Time had become her enemy, not the police. Her head ran the day like a film strip. The St. Francis Hotel, the sidewalk choke points, the moment Ford would step into public daylight. Every minute she spent preparing was a minute closer to that door opening. The irony, cruel enough to sound fictional, was that this hurried purchase came with a flaw. The gun wasn't properly sighted, its aim slightly off, an error measured in inches that would later separate a dead president from a living one. But Sara didn't know that. She slid the .38 into her bag like a sacred object, and when she walked back onto the street, her face looked almost calm, because in her mind, the state had already failed to stop her once, and she was determined to make sure it failed again. By early afternoon, the sidewalk outside the St. Francis Hotel had the restless electricity of an arena before the fighters enter. Flags fluttered. Tourists lifted cameras. Local workers paused with coffee cups in hand, pretending they didn't care while leaning closer anyway. The president was due to appear, and in a city trained by protest to gather around power, the crowd thickened naturally like weather. Sara Jane Moore watched it all with the detached focus of a predator. She didn't look like one. That was her gift. Suburban hair, ordinary clothes, the kind of face that belonged in a grocery store aisle. She blended into the mass without effort, becoming just another body in a line of bodies, another pair of eyes waiting for a glimpse. But inside her head, the scene was geometry. She measured angles, sight lines, choke points. She noted the rhythm of security, agents scanning left to right, their hands hovering near jackets, the way they created a moving bubble around the route. She watched where the crowd pressed hardest, where people leaned forward to wave, places where an arm could rise without immediately looking like a weapon. She shifted positions in small, forgettable steps, never rushing, never drawing attention. A step closer to the hotel entrance, a step toward the edge of the barricade. She learned which faces belonged to Secret Service by their eyes, too sharp, too awake, and which belonged to civilians by their excitement. She listened to the language of anticipation, the chatter, the laughter, the occasional political insult tossed into the air like a coin. No one was watching her. That was the point. In plain sight, she was invisible. Her hand rested near her bag, fingers touching the outline of the .38 through fabric. The metal felt calm, patient. She rehearsed the movement in her mind. Lift, aim, squeeze. So many times it became muscle memory without the muscle. Around her, people smiled and waved at nothing yet. Sara didn't smile. She studied. She waited. In the crowd's innocence, she found cover, and in its noise, she found the perfect silence to kill. The moment arrived without music, without warning, just the subtle shift of bodies as attention snapped toward the hotel doors. A ripple ran through the crowd like electricity searching for ground. People rose on their toes, arms lifting flags and cameras, mouths opening in the same breath. Then President Gerald Ford stepped into view, sunlight catching his hair, his face arranged in practiced calm. He waved, smiling as if the air wasn't full of risk. Secret Service tightened their formation, shoulders squared, eyes cutting through faces. Sara Jane Moore felt the world narrow to a single tunnel. The distance was roughly 40 feet, close enough to see the flash of cufflinks, far enough that one wrong inch could change history. Her heartbeat didn't race the way fear does. It steadied, almost clinical, like she'd entered the final line of an equation. Her fingers slid into her bag and wrapped around the revolver's grip. The metal was cold and certain. In that second, she wasn't a mother, not an accountant, not an informant slipping between loyalties. She was a hand chosen to deliver a message written in gunpowder. She brought her arm up through the noise, using the crowd's excitement as camouflage. No one screamed yet. No one moved fast enough. Ford turned slightly, still waving. Sara aligned the barrel, the sights crude and unforgiving. Her mind emptied, leaving only a single command. She squeezed. The crack of the .38 tore the afternoon apart. A sharp, brutal sound, too loud to be mistaken for anything else. For a fraction of time, the crowd froze in disbelief, as if reality had stuttered. Then panic erupted. Somewhere above the entrance, plaster exploded as the bullet struck the wall. An inch miss that would later be measured like a miracle. Sara tried to fire again, but the world was already crashing into her. Hands lunged. Bodies slammed. The film had opened with a shot, and now everyone on Post Street was inside it, trapped in a scene nobody could rewind. 5 inches. That was the distance between a livid president and a nation collapsing into blood-soaked shock. The bullet tore through the air so fast it became invisible, a line of death drawn across Post Street. For a heartbeat, it seemed aimed true, straight toward Gerald Ford's head as he stood framed by the hotel entrance, smiling, waving, unaware that history had just tried to murder him in public. Then the flaw in the weapon, an imperfect sight, a rushed purchase, betrayed the shooter. The round climbed slightly high and slammed into the wall above the St. Francis entrance with a savage crack, blasting plaster outward like white shrapnel. Dust puffed into Ford's space, a ghostly burst that made the scene feel unreal, like a photograph tearing itself apart. His smile vanished. Secret Service reacted on reflex. Men lunged in, bodies forming a human shield, hands gripping his arms and shoulders, forcing him backward with a violence that looked almost cruel. The crowd didn't understand at first. Some thought it was a firecracker, a stunt, a sound effect in a city used to protests. Then they saw the bullet hole, fresh, raw, staring from the wall like an open wound. And the truth hit them like a second shot. People screamed. Flags dropped. Cameras fell from hands and cracked on the sidewalk. A woman near the front collapsed to her knees, covering her head, sobbing without knowing why. Ford's eyes widened, startled not only by the danger, but by how close it had come, how easily the wave of his hand could have become the final image broadcast around the world. In the chaos, Sarah's arm was still raised, her face locked in a cold focus, as if even missing by inches didn't feel like failure, only delay. But 5 inches is everything. 5 inches is the reason he stayed alive long enough to be shoved toward the limousine, long enough to disappear into armored steel while San Francisco erupted behind him. 5 inches, an invisible mercy measured only after the sound had already shattered the afternoon. Oliver Sipple didn't think. He reacted. That was the difference between spectators and survivors, the difference the military drills into a man until instinct becomes faster than fear. When the crack of the revolver split the air and the crowd froze in confusion, Sipple's eyes snapped to the source. He saw the raised arm, the glint of metal, the unnatural stillness in Sara Jane Moore's posture. The second shot was already forming in her wrist, her elbow tightening, her finger resetting on the trigger. If she fired again, the chaos would give her cover. The president's movements would be unpredictable, and the next bullet might not miss. Sipple launched forward like a human missile, shoving past bodies that were only beginning to panic. His shoulder slammed into her side. His hand clamped her forearm with brutal force. The impact knocked her aim wide, wrenching the barrel toward the crowd. For an instant, their eyes met. His filled with raw urgency, hers flat with determination, like a woman staring at an obstacle rather than a person. She fought to re-aim, twisting, trying to bring the gun back to Ford, but Sipple's grip tightened, fingers digging into bone. The revolver bucked again, another crack, louder now in the close crush of bodies. A fragment of screaming metal and panic tore through the air. John Ludwig, a taxi driver standing nearby, jerked as he was struck, blood blooming on his side, the wound painful but not fatal. The crowd erupted into total chaos. People surged backward, trampling one another, faces warped in terror. Sipple didn't let go. He yanked her arm down, pinning it, forcing her wrist toward the pavement as more hands piled onto her. Secret Service, police, civilians, anyone close enough to smash the moment into the ground. The gun slipped, then was torn free. The president was already being swallowed by agents, but the second bullet had been stolen by one man's dive. Later, the headlines would call Sipple a hero. In that instant, He was something simpler and more violent. The hand that pushed murder off target. The split-second interruption that kept an assassination from becoming a funeral. The extraction was pure muscle and protocol. No debate, no hesitation, just men trained to drag history out of the kill zone. Secret Service agents slammed into Gerald Ford from both sides, folding him backward as if snapping a fragile object away from impact. One hand locked onto his belt. Another gripped his shoulder. Another shoved down his waving arm like it was a liability. Ford's shoes scraped the pavement. His body resisted for a fraction of a second. The human instinct to stay upright, fighting the mechanical violence of survival. Then he was swallowed by suits and forearms, his face disappearing behind a wall of bodies. "Move!" someone screamed. The limousine door flew open. Agents shoved him inside so hard his head nearly struck the interior frame. Another agent dove in after him, blocking his body with his own. The door slammed, metal clicked. The engine roared like an animal released. Outside, Post Street disintegrated into a riot of panic, people running, falling, clawing for space, while police tried to form lines that kept collapsing under the surge. Radios spat static and fragmented commands. A scream turned into a chorus. The motorcade erupted forward, tires squealing as the driver punched speed through downtown traffic. Sirens layered over one another until the city itself seemed to wail. The vehicles moved like a spear, lead car clearing lanes, motorcycles flanking, the presidential limo in the protected center, a hard knot of steel and urgency. At intersections, officers blocked cross streets with brutal authority, waving cars aside, pushing pedestrians back. The convoy hit open stretches and accelerated, slicing between buildings, racing toward airfield safety. Inside the limo, Ford sat rigid, breathing fast, eyes scanning faces that didn't offer comfort, only protection. He was alive, but the shock clung to him, the knowledge that inches had decided his fate. Behind them, outside the St. Francis, Sara Jane Moore was being crushed to the pavement, her weapon gone, her plan collapsing under handcuffs and screaming witnesses. San Francisco had just hosted an attempted execution, and the president had been ripped out of it like contraband, smuggled away under sirens, leaving the city shaking in the echo of a missed shot. Post Street became a sealed wound within minutes. Steel barricades snapped into place. Squad cars angled nose to block traffic. Red lights washing the hotel facade in a fever glow. Officers shouted civilians back with open palms and hard voices, forcing them behind tape that fluttered like a warning flag in the bay wind. The air still carried the burnt, sour trace of gunpowder. Secret Service agents moved like predators, fast, silent, scanning the ground for anything that didn't belong. Evidence markers appeared one by one, small yellow numbers blooming across the sidewalk like a grim constellation. A spent casing was located, photographed, then lifted with tweezers into a labeled bag. The bullet scar above the entrance became its own crime scene. Plaster fragments collected, the impact point measured, the angle mapped with string lines that made the wall look like it was being dissected. Technicians dusted for prints with brisk, controlled motions, black powder turning ordinary surfaces into confession. Witnesses were separated into clusters, each person tagged, questioned, recorded. Names, phone numbers, where they stood, what they saw. Everything reduced to data before panic could blur it. Reporters pressed forward, cameras hungry, but were shoved back by uniforms that didn't care about footage. Across the street, an ambulance treated the wounded taxi driver, blood-stained gauze, his face pale with shock as medics worked fast. Federal radios crackled nonstop, voices layered in urgency. Perimeter, vehicle checks, suspect custody, ballistic request, crowd control. In a nearby command post, agents began pulling camera film from tourists and press photographers, collecting every frame that might show the shooter's hand, the gun, the exact second the arm rose. San Francisco's downtown noise didn't stop, but inside the lockdown perimeter, the world narrowed into procedure. This wasn't just a sidewalk anymore. It was a historical site, a forensic diagram of how close the country had come to watching a president die in daylight. The case should have been simple: a lone woman, a gun, a missed shot. But inside the federal command post, a darker file slid onto the table and poisoned the room. Someone spoke her name with hesitation, then added the words that made every agent go still. She had been an informant. Not a rumor, not a theory. Documented contact history, notes of cooperation, prior interviews where she offered names and fragments of conversations from radical circles. For a moment, the attempted assassination stopped being only a security failure and became something closer to a counterintelligence nightmare. If she had been inside extremist networks and inside government attention, then the question wasn't just how she got close to Ford. It was how she moved through the cracks without being stopped. Analysts flipped through pages with gloved hands, eyes narrowing as they found timestamps, handler initials, vague evaluations that now looked like blindfolds. Low-level threat, emotionally unstable, useful source. Those words sounded obscene in the aftermath of a bullet hole above the hotel entrance. Phones rang nonstop. Supervisors demanded answers that nobody could give. Who signed off on releasing her? Who decided confiscating the .44 and ammunition was enough? Why wasn't she flagged as an imminent danger when the president was scheduled to appear hours later? The informant label complicated everything. It meant she wasn't an unknown. She was a known risk, yet treated like paperwork, not a ticking weapon. Some agents argued she had played law enforcement, feeding them scraps to appear cooperative while feeding radicals her own performance of loyalty. Others feared something worse, that she had been mishandled, underestimated, maybe even pushed too close to the fire and allowed to burn. In the corner of the room, a senior investigator wrote a single line on a board in thick black marker. Who knew what and when? And the silence that followed felt heavier than the gun itself. By nightfall, the city was calm again, but the investigation wasn't. It moved deeper, colder, turning from an open and shut crime into a hunt for invisible fingerprints. The bullet hole above the St. Francis wasn't just proof of intent. It was proof of access, of timing, of failures that felt too convenient to ignore. Inside the task force, a rumor began to breathe. Sara Jane Moore might not have been only a lone hand. She had traveled between worlds, militant rooms and official rooms, too easily, too smoothly. That kind of movement creates shadows, and shadows invite theories. Agents mapped her contacts across two networks: radicals who wanted spectacle and bureaucrats who wanted information. The overlap was terrifying. Who had guided her? Who had provided confidence, encouragement, maybe even the subtle illusion that she was protected? Investigators pulled handler logs and found gaps. missing details, vague summaries, calls not fully documented. It wasn't proof of conspiracy, but it was enough to make seasoned men uneasy. They questioned sources in militant circles who spoke in riddles about support, about signals, about someone who liked watching chaos but never touched the gun. Meanwhile, in Sara's personal history, patterns emerged. She often acted like a woman trying to prove loyalty to someone unseen, as if she feared being exposed, abandoned, erased. That pressure could have been internal or applied from outside like a thumb on a bruise. In interrogation, she hinted at paranoia, at feeling watched from both sides, at needing to perform a final act that would end all suspicion. To the public, she was the assassin. To investigators, she was a portal. If she had once reported names, then her handlers had once trusted her. If militants accepted her, then they believed she was useful. In that seam between acceptance and manipulation, an ugly possibility formed. Someone might have let her slip, might have underestimated her on purpose, might have wanted the attempt to happen without the death, an explosion of fear without the body. The theory was dangerous and unprovable, but it wouldn't die. Because when a president nearly gets shot in broad daylight, the simplest explanation feels too small. And somewhere behind Sara Jane Moore's calm stare, the task force began to sense it. An outline in the fog, a hidden hand that might never appear on paper, yet could still shape the trigger. The task force didn't sleep. By the second day, the case had grown teeth, no longer focused only on the woman in custody, but on the ecosystem that had surrounded her. Federal warrants hit desks like hammers. Phone lines were targeted not with curiosity but with urgency. Any number tied to Sara, any number tied to the radical circles she hovered around, any number that appeared twice in the same week. Technicians built wiretap rigs in cramped rooms that smelled of coffee and overheated electronics, headphones clamped tight, fingers hovering over switches to capture every syllable. Each recorded call became a weapon, time-stamped, transcribed, cross-referenced, because in an assassination attempt, language is evidence long before bullets are. Outside, surveillance teams rolled into motion. Tail cars took positions like chess pieces, unmarked sedans with tinted glass, engines idling, agents staring forward for hours until their eyes burned. They tracked associates leaving apartments, followed them through traffic, watched them meet in diners, parks, back alleys, anywhere a conversation could happen away from microphones. The city became a grid. Every street light, every corner store, every parking garage was a potential handoff point. The teams rotated in silence, one car peeling off, another sliding in, so no target could detect the drift. But sometimes the suspects weren't amateurs. Twice, a tail nearly got burned, a sudden U-turn, a hard brake, a look in the rearview mirror too sharp to be casual. Agents clenched jaws, stayed disciplined, kept distance, refusing to rush. They weren't chasing just radicals now. They were chasing the possibility of a wider plot, a pipeline of influence that could birth another shooter. In the command center, the board filled with new names, new arrows, new dates. A wiretap caught a coded phrase. A tail car spotted a meeting. The net tightened, invisible but relentless, as if the city itself was being wrapped in surveillance. And in that cold, methodical hunt, the investigators made one thing clear. The bullet outside the St. Francis would not be treated as an ending. It was a doorway. They needed more than recordings and taillights. They needed a heartbeat inside the circle, someone who could sit in a room, smell the sweat, see the hands under the table. So the task force built an undercover identity like a weapon, a new name, a new resume, a believable anger, and just enough recklessness to look authentic. The operative arrived in the network through a soft entry point, an activist group that drifted close to militant talk but still pretended to be harmless. He listened first, offering sympathy instead of questions, letting others fill the silence with their own appetites. The key was patience. Extremists didn't trust enthusiasm, they trusted suffering. So he staged it. Stories of being fired, betrayed, radicalized by the system. He learned the slang, the coded jokes, the way ideology was used as camouflage for violence. Weeks collapsed into days. He was invited deeper, into apartments where windows stayed shut and everyone spoke as if microphones lived in the walls. There, Sara Jane Moore's name surfaced like a bruise. Some spat it with disgust, calling her sloppy, reckless, a spotlight-hungry fool. Others spoke of her with a strange respect, like she'd almost achieved what they only fantasized about. And then the operative heard something that changed the entire temperature of the case. Murmurs of guidance, of encouragement, of someone who had whispered that she would be protected, someone who never appeared at meetings, never raised a fist, never touched a weapon, yet somehow shaped the air. It wasn't proof. It was worse. It was implication. The operative pressed gently, never too hungry, never too eager, letting the radicals talk themselves into exposing their own mythology. He took notes in memory, because paper could get him killed. One night, in a dim room thick with smoke, he heard the phrase that made his blood go cold. She wasn't supposed to miss. The sentence wasn't shouted. It was spoken like disappointment, like a plan that had slipped. When he reported it back, supervisors didn't celebrate. They tightened security, escalated raids, and told him the truth he already knew. He wasn't infiltrating a group anymore. He was walking into a machine that might still be spinning, looking for the next trigger. The warrant hit at 4:12 a.m., the hour when cities breathe slow and criminals believe they're invisible. A stacked team moved up the stairwell in silence, boots soft, weapons angled down, flashlights taped to reduce glare. The target was a fourth-floor apartment rumored to be a safe room, a place where talk turned into logistics. The door came apart in one brutal second. Wood splintered, hinges screamed, and the first agent through the frame swept left with his pistol raised. "Federal! Hands!" The room smelled like stale coffee and sweat. No gunfire, only frantic movement. A man scrambling toward a bedroom before being tackled hard into the carpet. Another suspect froze with both hands up, eyes wide, mouth working without sound. Agents cleared the apartment fast. Bathroom, closet, kitchen, then went to work with gloves and evidence bags like surgeons after a crash. What they found wasn't a manifesto. It was infrastructure. A cardboard box under the bed held street maps with routes circled in red. Government buildings, hotels, rally sites. On the kitchen table sat a notebook filled with coded phrases and phone numbers written in tight, obsessive script. In the closet, A duffel bag packed with spare clothing, wigs, and false IDs. Faces that could be worn and discarded. Then the basement key turned the raid into something darker. 2 agents descended into a storage space below the building, flashlights cutting through dust. Behind a false panel, they discovered the cache. Weapons wrapped in oily cloth, ammunition taped in bundles, and a portable radio scanner that still hummed with life. It wasn't enough to prove a coordinated assassination ring, but it was enough to prove planning beyond one impulsive woman. One agent lifted a map and saw the St. Francis Hotel marked weeks in advance, along with 3 other locations penciled in like sequels. In the command post, when the photos arrived, the room went quiet. The bullet on Post Street had been treated as a lone moment of madness. The underground cache said otherwise. It suggested contingency, preparation, a pipeline of violence waiting for the next opening. And for the first time, the task force felt it in their bones. San Francisco had not witnessed the final act. It had witnessed the opening scene. The interrogation room was cold enough to feel surgical. A single bulb buzzed overhead, bleaching the color out of everything it touched. Table, chairs, walls, the face of the woman who had nearly rewritten American history. Sara Jane Moore sat with her hands cuffed in front of her, posture straight, expression calm, as if she were waiting for a bank appointment instead of federal judgment. The agent across from her slid a folder onto the table and opened it slowly, letting photographs speak first. The revolver, the bullet hole above the St. Francis entrance, Ford being shoved into the limousine. Sara didn't flinch. Her eyes moved over each image with the detached interest of someone reviewing work already completed. "Why?" the agent asked, voice controlled. Sara tilted her head slightly as if the question itself was naive. She didn't deny the shot. She didn't hide behind confusion. She spoke in measured sentences, cold and direct. Politics, symbols, necessity. She used the language of ideology like armor, turning murder into an argument. When the agent pushed harder, asked about regret, about the wounded bystander, about the crowd of civilians, her mouth tightened in irritation, not shame. "Collateral," she murmured, as if the word could erase blood. Another agent entered with a second file, informant records, handler notes, prior contacts. This time, Sara's eyes sharpened, a faint spark of anger waking behind the calm. "So you knew me," she said softly, almost accusing. "You watched me." They asked if anyone guided her, if anyone supplied the weapon, if anyone ordered the shot. Sara's gaze turned distant, then returned with a hard edge. "I chose it," she said. "I decided." The room filled with a heavy silence. No tears, no shaking voice, no pleading for mercy. Only a woman speaking like she was proud of her own fall. And when the agent finally said the words, "attempted assassination of the president," Sara didn't blink. She stared forward, icy and unbroken, as if remorse was a luxury meant for weaker people. The first crack in Sara Jane Moore's armor wasn't guilt. It was fear. Not fear of prison, not fear of the president's power, but fear of being unmasked. When agents began sliding informant paperwork across the table, handler initials, dates, small clipped notes, her jaw tightened as if someone had pressed a blade to an old bruise. "That's not the point," she snapped, then immediately cooled herself, regaining the calm that had become her signature. But the mask had shifted. Her eyes kept flicking toward the file like it was radioactive. The lead interrogator leaned in, voice low. You fed us names. You sat in their rooms, listened to their plans. What happens to an informant when radicals find out? Sarah's mouth twitched, half contempt, half truth. They don't forgive, she said. The room went still. In her tone was a reality deeper than ideology. Informants don't get second chances, only funerals. She admitted she'd felt the paranoia tightening around her in the weeks before the attempt. Extra questions, longer stares, sudden silences when she entered a room. She sensed suspicion, blooming like mold. A woman living between worlds can survive only as long as both sides believe she belongs. When that belief cracks, the middle becomes a grave. I was getting boxed in, she said, voice flatter now, as if describing weather. They wanted proof. The agents exchanged a glance. Proof meant blood, headlines, spectacle. The exact currency of the extremist mind. Sara didn't confess to a handler ordering her to shoot, but she described a pressure that sounded like invisible hands at her throat. The need to erase doubt, to burn the bridge behind her, so no one could call her traitor. In that twisted logic, the assassination attempt wasn't only political. It was personal survival. A public act so extreme it would rewrite her identity forever. No longer informant, no longer questionable, no longer exposed, just committed, just irreversible. And as she spoke, the investigators understood something terrifying. She didn't fire to die. She fired to belong. The case tightened around Sara Jane Moore like rope drawn through steel rings, each hour adding a new knot she couldn't slip. Ballistics came first. The .38 revolver logged, test fired, its imperfect sights documented, the spent casing matched with clinical certainty, the bullet impact above the Saint. Francis' entrance was measured, photographed, reconstructed, trajectory lines proving the shot had traveled exactly as witnesses described. Then the visuals arrived. Tourists had filmed the scene unintentionally, their shaky cameras capturing the fatal seconds. The president waving, the crowd packed tight, Sarah's arm rising clean through the air. Frame by frame, analysts froze the moment of intent. Her wrist alignment, the revolver's silhouette, the recoil after the first shot. Photographers provided stills where her face looked eerily calm, eyes fixed on the target like she was aiming at an object, not a human being. Witness statements stacked into a wall of agreement. Where she stood, how she moved, the sound of the shot, Oliver Sippel's dive, the second discharge that wounded the bystander. A medical report confirmed the taxi driver's injury, linking timing and angle to the diverted weapon. Even her earlier contact with police became evidence, not of innocence, but of warning signs ignored. The prosecution didn't need imagination. They built a chain so solid it felt like iron. Motive implied by her own words, means proven by the weapon, opportunity captured in footage, execution witnessed by dozens. Every path led back to the same center, Sara, gun in hand, deciding to turn a public sidewalk into a killing stage. In the interrogation room, she could posture, intellectualize, deny deeper networks. It didn't matter. The evidence didn't argue. It strangled. And as the file grew heavier, investigators understood. This wasn't a case they would solve. It was a case they would lock, tight, final, impossible to escape. The review began like an autopsy. Behind locked doors, Secret Service supervisors replayed September 22nd with a brutality the public would never see. Every step, every decision, every missed warning reduced to minutes and inches. They laid Post Street on a table in photographs and diagrams, marking the crowd line, the barricade gaps, the blind angles where a hand could rise without being challenged. Agents who had shielded Ford were praised, but the system around them was dissected without mercy. The most damning fact wasn't the bullet hole. It was what came before it. Sara Jane Moore had been known, contacted, evaluated, even stopped. A weapon had been confiscated. Ammunition counted, 113 rounds, and still she had walked free into the same day the president would appear. That contradiction burned like acid. Briefings turned into interrogations. Why wasn't she flagged as an imminent threat? Why wasn't her name pushed higher, louder, urgent? Paperwork was read aloud in cold rooms, phrases like low risk and unstable but cooperative, echoing like jokes told at a funeral. After the attempt, protocols tightened overnight. Advance teams demanded heavier perimeters, longer buffer zones, stricter crowd screening. Agents began scanning hands more aggressively, eyes moving faster, nerves wired tighter. Ford himself changed. Security around him thickened, movement shortened, public exposure reduced. The miss had taught everyone the same lesson. A president doesn't survive by faith in order. He survives by anticipating disorder. The collapse wasn't only physical, it was psychological. The Secret Service understood that chaos didn't need an army. It only needed one person slipping through a gap everyone assumed was harmless. The panic spread faster than the facts. Within hours, radios and televisions across the country repeated the same phrase, another attempt on President Ford. And the word another carried poison. America had already been shaken by the earlier attack weeks before. Now the second gunshot confirmed a terrifying pattern. The president was becoming a moving target, and the nation was watching in real time. In San Francisco, people who had stood outside the Saint. Francis replayed the moment in their heads until sleep turned into siren dreams. Parents gripped children tighter in crowds. Tourists avoided rallies. The fear wasn't abstract anymore. It had a sound, a sharp crack that could happen anywhere. Inside law enforcement circles, a deeper dread took shape. Copycats. Analysts warned that violent ideologues feed on headlines the way arsonists feed on dry wind. One failed attempt could inspire 5 more. Threat calls increased. Anonymous voices promising next time, letters filled with hate, scribbled fantasies mailed to government offices. Each new threat forced agents to treat boredom as danger, to investigate the absurd as if it were real. Secret Service workload doubled, then tripled. Every presidential appearance became a military operation, every sidewalk a potential firing line. Sara Jane Moore's face, broadcast in handcuffs, became both caution and spark. For extremists, she was proof that one person could reach the president. For unstable minds, she was permission. Investigators sifted new leads daily, names surfacing in wiretaps, chatter in radical circles shifting toward finishing what she started. The country began to feel like it was walking under a loose ceiling, waiting for the next crack. And in that climate, the task force understood. Stopping Sara had not ended the threat. It had simply announced it. The final sweep moved like a storm front, silent at first, then sudden and overwhelming. Federal agents and SFPD teams hit addresses before dawn, boots pounding stairwells, flashlights cutting through dirty hallways. Doors came down with battering rams, splinters flying, suspects yanked from beds still tangled in sheets. Some apartments were empty, except for propaganda and ashtrays. Others held the kind of proof that made agents' stomachs tighten. Ammunition taped in bundles, knives sharpened to needles, handwritten route notes, lists of public events circled in red. Not everyone rated was a real operator. Some were loud talkers, intoxicated on ideology, but incapable of pulling a trigger. Others were worse, quiet, disciplined, and angry enough to act. Investigators separated the harmless from the dangerous through hours of interviews and pressure, using wiretap fragments and surveillance photos like scalpels. One suspect cracked under questioning and admitted there had been discussions about multiple attempts, about creating a sequence of attacks to overwhelm protection. Another tried to play innocent until agents dropped photographs of meetings and phone transcripts on the table like weights. The city became a chessboard of stakeouts and sudden arrests. Men tailed through traffic, handoffs intercepted in parking lots, a courier tackled on a sidewalk with a bag full of coded notes. By the end of the week, the task force had pulled dozens into custody or under watch, dismantling small cells before they could harden into violence. It wasn't a cinematic victory, no single mastermind, no dramatic confession, just relentless pressure until the network suffocated. And in the exhausted silence afterward, agents understood the bitter truth. You don't stop fear by catching one shooter. You stop it by draining the entire swamp that feeds the next one. Federal court in San Francisco felt less like justice and more like a fortified zone. Armed marshals lined the walls, hands resting near holsters, eyes scanning the gallery as if expecting another weapon to rise from the crowd. Reporters packed the benches shoulder to shoulder, notebooks poised like knives, cameras hungry for the face of the woman who had tried to kill a president. Outside, barricades and uniformed officers turned the courthouse steps into a checkpoint. Inside, the air was cold, fluorescent, and tense enough to snap. When Sara Jane Moore was brought in, chains faintly clinking, the room shifted, an almost physical recoil. She didn't arrive broken. She walked with controlled posture, chin level, expression unreadable, as if she were entering a meeting rather than a battlefield. The prosecution opened with force. Photographs of Ford being crushed into the limousine, the revolver held up in a gloved hand, the bullet hole above the St. Francis entrance displayed like a scar on the city's face. Witnesses followed in a brutal sequence. Oliver Sipple described the dive, the grip, the second shot, his voice steady, his hands still remembering the violence. The injured taxi driver testified about the moment pain hit him, blood soaking through his shirt while strangers screamed and ran. Secret Service agents detailed extraction protocols, the split-second shield formation, the sensation of being inches from national catastrophe. Each testimony tightened the atmosphere, turning the courtroom into a controlled replay of panic. Sara sat without visible reaction, eyes forward, face still. When evidence was presented, ballistics reports, frame-by-frame film stills of her arm lifting, jurors leaned in as if the images might fire again. Defense arguments sounded small under the weight of the facts. There was no mystery about what happened, only the terrifying clarity of how close it came. The judge maintained a steady tone, but even his restraint carried gravity. This wasn't merely an assault. It was an attack on the American state itself. And as the days stretched on, it became clear. The courtroom wasn't deciding whether she did it. It was deciding what kind of monster history would remember her as. Sara Jane Moore did not play the usual courtroom game. She didn't collapse into tears, didn't beg the judge for mercy, didn't hide behind a fog of madness. When the moment came, she stood and entered her plea with a voice that was calm enough to insult the deadliness of what she'd done. Guilty. One word that landed like a hammer, not as surrender, but as ownership. The defense had floated the edges of instability, emotional disturbance, political confusion, but Sara refused to be filed away as merely broken. She wanted her act to be remembered as deliberate, a political strike, not a symptom. In that refusal, there was something chilling. She was willing to live forever in a cage as long as history couldn't dismiss her. The prosecutor laid out the facts one last time, each detail sharpened into steel. Distance, trajectory, the bullet hole above the hotel entrance, the diversion caused by Oliver Sippel's dive, the innocent man bleeding in the aftermath. The courtroom listened like it was holding its breath for the final verdict of gravity itself. Then the judge spoke. His tone was controlled, but the meaning was brutal. The charge was not simply violence. It was an attempt to execute the President of the United States in public. The sentence came down with the weight of national trauma. Life imprisonment. A permanent removal from society. A message carved into law. Sara's face barely changed. No visible shaking, no sudden collapse. Only a slow blink, as if she were acknowledging the closing of a door she had already walked toward. When the marshals moved to lead her away, chains clinking softly, she did not look back at the jury for sympathy. She looked straight ahead, expression cold, carrying herself like someone who believed the world had failed, not her. When the hearing ended, the courtroom exhaled like a room waking from a nightmare. Chairs creaked, reporters rushed for phones, jurors stared at the floor as if avoiding the ghost of the bullet hole. Sara Jane Moore was the last body still moving in slow motion. Two marshals took her elbows, not gently, not violently, but with the practiced firmness reserved for dangerous history. The chain at her waist pulled tight as they guided her toward the side door. For a moment, the crowd of witnesses and officials watched in complete silence, as if no one trusted sound anymore. She walked past the prosecution table where files were stacked like tombstones, past the defense counsel who looked exhausted, defeated not by argument, but by reality, past photographers who tried to catch one final emotion on her face. Sara gave them almost nothing. Her eyes remained level, expression sealed, a mask so disciplined it felt inhuman. Then, just before the door swallowed her, she turned her head once, slowly, deliberately, as if granting the room one final image. It wasn't regret. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't even pride. It was something colder, recognition, as though she understood she had become a symbol now, locked into the nation's memory whether she wanted it or not. Her gaze swept across the gallery, not looking for forgiveness, not searching for someone to blame. It looked like she was measuring them, measuring the world that would go on without her. A reporter later said her eyes looked empty. A marshal said they looked focused. Both were right. Sara didn't speak. She didn't spit out ideology or prophecy. She simply held the stare for a heartbeat longer than necessary, letting everyone feel the unsettling truth. The most terrifying attackers aren't always roaring monsters. Sometimes they're quiet, composed, ordinary-looking people who step forward with a gun and a calm face. The door closed. Metal clicked, and the echo of that click felt final, like a coffin lid sealing on an event that had missed catastrophe by inches, yet would haunt the country for years. Years later, the shot on Post Street refused to die. It lived in training manuals, in classified briefings, in the quiet nightmares of agents who had felt a president's body jerk under their hands. The Saint. Francis Hotel entrance was repaired, repainted, made clean for tourists. Yet investigators still remembered the precise point where plaster exploded and time nearly changed. 5 inches, they would say, as if the number were a prayer and a warning at once. The attempt became a case study in how danger doesn't always look dangerous, how a woman with a forgettable face could step out of a crowd and almost execute the leader of a nation. Security doctrine shifted because of her. Perimeters widened. Crowds were treated like oceans full of unseen currents. Hands were watched more than faces, and Sara Jane Moore, locked behind federal walls, became a grim symbol of modern political violence. Not a soldier, not a mastermind, but a volatile human weapon that slipped through cracks everyone assumed were harmless. In prison, she aged out of headlines, but not out of consequence. The country moved on, yet the echo remained. Proof that history can hinge on a flawed sight, a single dive, a single missed inch. In the years that followed, Sara Jane Moore became a contradiction even in captivity. Part cautionary tale, part unresolved question. Behind prison walls, where time is measured in steel doors and fluorescent mornings, she gave statements that shifted like weather. Some days, she spoke as if remorse had finally found her, describing the attempt as a terrible decision, admitting that she had endangered strangers who never agreed to be part of her ideology. Other days, the tone hardened again. She sounded less sorry for what she tried to do than for what she failed to accomplish. That ambiguity haunted investigators more than a simple confession would have, because true regret has weight. It bends a person, forces them to face the victims. Sara rarely bent. She often framed the event as a turning point in her own life, not in the lives of those she nearly destroyed. Psychologists who studied her records describe shifting identities, the urge to justify, the need to remain significant even when the world stopped looking. She had once craved belonging so badly she aimed a gun at a president. In prison, she craved meaning so badly she reshaped her story depending on who listened. When parole hearings or interviews surfaced, observers noticed the same cold discipline, controlled posture, careful language, eyes that rarely softened. She could acknowledge harm without sounding haunted by it. To some, that was denial. To others, it was something darker, an emotional emptiness that allowed her to move from informant to assassin without ever fully feeling the gravity. What she regretted most might not have been the violence, but the miscalculation, the flawed weapon, the dive that ruined her aim, the missed inches that turned her into a failed killer rather than a historical executioner. In the end, even decades later, the question remained unsettled. Did she repent, or did she simply adapt to the fact that the world would only remember her as the woman who almost did it, but didn't? Post Street looks ordinary now. Cars glide past the St. Francis Hotel as if nothing ever happened. Tourists pause for photographs, and the entrance stands polished, clean stone, clean glass, clean history. Yet if you know where to look, you can still feel the old scar. Not the plaster anymore, not the literal hole that was repaired, but the invisible impact point where a nation nearly watched a president die. In the late afternoon light, the doorway becomes a frame again, and for a second, you can almost see it. Ford's wave, the crowd packed tight, the raised arm cutting through excitement like a knife. 5 inches. The measurement sounds small until you realize it is the distance between continuity and chaos, between a living timeline and a shattered one. That is the cold truth the case leaves behind. History doesn't always survive because it is strong. Sometimes it survives because a gun sight is off, because a stranger dives at the right second, because fate hesitates. And yet, the human ending refuses to settle into comfort. Because even after the trial, after the sentence, after decades of files and interviews, the case still breathes uncertainty like fog rolling off the bay. Sara Jane Moore was real. The gun was real. The intent was real. But the shadows around her remain harder to erase than the bullet hole ever was. An informant who drifted too close to militants. A woman mishandled, underestimated, released. Conversations half recorded, gaps in paperwork, rumors of guidance and disappointment she wasn't supposed to miss. Maybe it was only paranoia, the mythology radicals build to excuse failure. Maybe it was simply a lone hand attached to a fractured mind. Or maybe she was something more unsettling, the visible tip of an invisible war. Ideology, manipulation, institutional blind spots, colliding on a sidewalk in broad daylight. The street keeps moving, the city keeps breathing, and life goes on. But the last question hangs there, quiet and persistent, forcing the listener to face it without relief. Was Sara Jane Moore alone? Or was she only the hand that happened to be caught on camera?